I always give my own disclaimer before these talks, especially before one like this. I'm just a dude. I am not a PhD. I'm not an authority on any information. I'm literally just a guy that during the COVID era realized how little I knew and realized how much we were being lied to. And so I started researching it for myself. And in the process of researching, I've gotten relatively good at research, and I've gotten relatively good at finding facts and data and sifting through things. And I will do my best. This presentation is not the best format to share all of my sources with you, but I do my best to share my sources, especially in my videos, so that you guys can do your own research and come to your own conclusions, because I believe that the way forwards for our world is not for a centralized source or a single person to tell everyone the truth anymore. We have seen the pitfalls of that model. The way forward now is for us all to have to be the arbiters of truth for ourselves, because there's too much money invested in steering our narratives, steering our culture, steering our perceptions towards whatever big money wants us to think and believe. So we are also going to be mentioning Israel quite a bit tonight. And if you're not sure why, we'll get to that in just a second. And so right at the outset, I want to be very clear, and I'll elaborate on why and how this is true as we go forwards. But when we talk about Israel, you may have a little like response within you. And don't worry, we are talking about a government of a state, of a nation in our world, just like any other government. And every government has deep levels of corruption within them, some more so than others. And when we talk about Israel, we're not talking about all Jewish people all across the world, okay? We're talking about the people involved in the crimes that we're talking about. And tonight specifically, we're talking about one of the most evil and corrupt criminal networks that the world has ever known, at least in our time. And so I just want to remind everyone that when we describe the features of that criminal network, we're specifically talking about the criminals in that network. And we're specifically talking about how organized crime works and how this operation works, okay? And we'll get more into how and why that's true in just a minute. But first, I want to just really quickly admire our President Bill Clinton in his nice blue dress. That is a painting that was found in Jeffrey Epstein's estate. So, a little bit of quick background on some of the basic concepts that we're going to cover today. And if you're familiar with my content, you should be familiar with most of this. But we're about to talk about intelligence agency operations. And it's important to remember every time you talk about intelligence agencies that intelligence agencies are designed to be hard to track down. Everything they do is designed to be hidden and concealed. It's designed to be untraceable back to its source. And so inherently, when you're reporting on a news topic that's just like, the storm came in and it did this damage to the shop, or like this event happened in town and this is how it went. Those things are not designed to be concealed, and it is very easy to report factually on those things because all the data is here. Intelligence agencies specifically orchestrate their operations in order to conceal their nature, to conceal their funding, to conceal what's really going on. And so you inherently have to grasp a little bit more, and often the thing that blows an entire CIA operation wide open is just one little snippet of one little piece of text in one little document that gets declassified at some point, and then that implies all these other things, and things go from there. So when you're talking about any intelligence operation, all throughout history, you're inherently piecing together fragments of data to paint a picture. And so there's a certain level of uncertainty that we have to live with when we try to dig this stuff up. And there's a certain level of speculation that you have to be willing to engage in. And that's not to say that you know what's true, but just to probe the likely possibilities, right? And so when I talk about what my perception of the truth is here tonight, I'm just saying that this is what I see as most likely true based upon the evidence that I've seen. And I would encourage you all to go on your own journey of digging through the evidence, judging it for yourself, and deciding what seems most likely to you over time. So I'm going to give you a bit of a jump start on what I've found and kind of share with you some leads, share with you what I think, and I would encourage you all to think for yourselves. Because the very purpose of an intelligence agency is plausible deniability, right? If you needed to do some operation in a foreign country and it didn't need to be a secret, you would just send your military. There is no reason to have a covert intelligence agency like the CIA or Mossad or MI6 or any of the numerous other ones around the world, other than to keep what it's doing secret. They're designed to do that. They're very good at doing that, and that's what they've been doing all throughout their history, right? And so I want to remind us of this quote from Alexander Acosta. I was told Epstein belonged to intelligence and to leave it alone, right? There's going to be a theme running all throughout is what intelligence are we looking at? When you look at intelligence agency operations, there's an important distinction to be made. Agents versus assets. And this trips up a lot of people in the normal world that don't think about this stuff all the time, is agents of an intelligence agency are like card-carrying CIA agents that were hired by the CIA, trained by the CIA, that actually are officially working for the CIA or whatever other operation, right? And that is only one class. And that is actually the far less important and far smaller class of people that we generally are talking about, because an asset is anyone out in the world that you might work with intentionally, and they might know you're working with them, or that you might work with subversively. They might be getting played or manipulated, and they might not even realize it. They might be getting blackmailed and being forced to do things on behalf of your intelligence agency. So an asset could be just about anyone in this world. And I put, a couple of well-known faces on the screen that you could make a very strong argument that these guys are assets. Bezos is one of the largest government contractors with the CIA and the other intelligence agencies in America there is today. A lot of people think of Amazon as just sending you your package and your dog food and whatever else, but actually Amazon runs a whole bunch of the cloud computing for the intelligence agency in America, as well as a whole bunch of the other kind of backdoor data and computer networking things for the CIA, NSA, etc. And so you could call Jeff Bezos an asset, assuming he's not actually card-carrying CIA agent. I don't think he is, but who knows? I suspect Sam Bankman-Fried was an asset, if not an agent. Bill Gates, we're going to talk a fair bit about tonight. And Mark Zuckerberg, I think we all know what he's done with our government on behalf of the intelligence agencies. So when you talk about the greater intelligence network, this is actually why intelligence agencies were founded in the first place, is because during World War II, the U.S. founded the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, and they hired a corporate lawyer to found our first intelligence agency, because a corporate lawyer is already best friends with all of the owners of the biggest corporations in the world. And so if you need someone to ship something to that other country, you know a guy that runs a shipping company. If you need someone to make some weapons, you know a guy that runs a military industrial contracting company. If you need a guy that does a thing, a corporate lawyer already knows all these guys that own all these companies, right? And so intelligence agencies actually are more like networks of corporations that are collaborating for the purposes of their nation. Usually it's behind the scenes. Usually they try to keep it quiet. But like Palantir, we'll talk a fair bit about tonight, they were actually founded by CIA money initially, and they've been a CIA contractor ever since. JP Morgan, you might not think of, but actually JP Morgan was the bank for Jeffrey Epstein, and they protected his money and his identity and his operations all throughout. And now they're trying to scuttle away from that fact and pretend like they didn't know. Jeffrey Epstein was referring high net worth individuals through the back door of JP Morgan for their money laundering services all along. So when you think about intelligence agencies and the intelligence network, don't think about like M and Q and Bond in the James Bond movies. Think about all of the corporations that helped Q make all those gadgets. Think about all of the corporations that help the CIA spy on American citizens, right? Those corporations are the real power of an intelligence network, and that's what we're going to be talking about tonight, is how you foster an intelligence network through coercive means, right? Or through willing means. So Jeffrey Epstein. This guy is often painted as a sex trafficker who abused young girls and was just a total freak. And the mainstream storytelling about him sort of paints him as this lone wolf pervert that did his own thing with these girls. And for a long time, it's been harder and harder for them these days, but for a long time, they tried to paint it as though no one knew if he worked with anyone. He was just this crazy billionaire eccentric guy. And that is 100% not the case. And we're going to go through all the reasons why it's not tonight. But it's important to look at how the mainstream media reports on these things, because the mainstream media is one of the most important assets in the intelligence network for obvious reasons. So I'm going to be drawing heavily upon the work of those that came before me. And I'm just going to give a shout out to 4 of them here, but they are legion. There are numerous people that have done far more work than me. I'm not really what you would call a journalist. I'm more of a communicator. These people are more of the real journalists that are doing the real work, that are actually out there getting sources, sifting through files, citing things, writing books, things like that. And without people like this, People like me could not exist, and people like you could never hear these kinds of truths. So Whitney Webb is someone we're going to draw from extensively tonight because she literally wrote the book on Epstein, One Nation Under Blackmail, Volume 1 and 2. And I highly recommend that everybody check out her website, Unlimited Hangout. It is a treasure trove of highly researched, very intense journalism that treats all powerful people equally. She is equally skeptical of Donald Trump as she is of Kamala Harris and everyone in between, and it's very refreshing in these times. Ryan Dawson, he's been around since before most of us were even thinking about these conspiracy theories and these truths. I'm actually wearing a shirt from Ryan Dawson's website, the Anti-Neocon Report. So if you want this shirt, it's the Jeffrey Epstein Network shirt. Check out Ryan Dawson. He's done extensive work on 9/11, on Jeffrey Epstein, and much, much more, the American Empire, etc. Johnny Vedmore helped write the One Nation Under Blackmail books, and he now runs his own website called Newspaste. He's an excellent journalist, and he's very well versed in Epstein. We'll be referencing some of his articles today. And Liz Crokin will feature much more prominently in next week's talk, but she has also done extensive work on the Epstein case as well. She used to be a Hollywood reporter, and when she started reporting on Pizzagate and all of the pedophilia that's happening in Hollywood, she got blacklisted, smeared, kicked out, and basically everything they tried to kill her dog. Basically everything that you could do to a journalist, they did to Liz, and she's been through the fires and back. So we'll be drawing from Liz a little bit tonight and a lot next week. And there are many, many more than this. This is just 4 people that come to mind and that I'm drawing from a little bit tonight specifically. So, real quickly, we're going to talk about blackmail and where this operation comes from before we actually talk about the Jeffrey Epstein network itself. And then we're going to get to all of the pieces of the Jeffrey Epstein network that kind of get pushed under the rug, so they can just focus on this one central aspect of, Epstein getting massages from young girls, because it's way bigger than that. Video and photographic sexual blackmail was pioneered by the mob in the 1930s and 40s. And at the time, it was mostly the Italian mafia and the Jewish mob. There was also a bit of Irish mafia going on in the United States too, but the Italian mafia and the Jewish mob really rose to power during the Prohibition era in the 20s, when it went from a bunch of little street gangs to an international crime syndicate, because suddenly the entire country wanted to buy an illegal product. And so the illegal gangs were the ones that would supply it. And they went from, lowly gangsters to some of the richest men on the planet. And they developed all these smuggling and trafficking networks, and they started to work together. A quick note on organized crime. I've said this many times. Organized crime naturally organizes around racial identities. Because if you're going to commit a whole bunch of crimes, you're going to want to do it with someone you trust. Because if you do it with someone you don't trust and they get caught, they're going to rat you out. Right? It's the most basic concept in the book, and every criminal understands it, and it's very obvious once you think about it. And that's why you have black street gangs that identify with their hood. That's why you have the Jewish mob identifying with their racial identity. That's why you have the Italian mafia identifying with their racial identity, right? And they sometimes work together and they sometimes intermingle, but inherently your highest level of trust is for the people that are most like you, right? And so when we talk about people's racial identities, it is in relation to how that is a indicator that you're seeing an organized crime network. When you see a whole bunch of criminals doing a whole bunch of crime and they all share a racial identity, that's indicative that you're looking at the mafia or the mob or whatever other group it is, the Yakuza, the Bratvo, whatever. So J. Edgar Hoover is this man on the left in that photo. And back in the 30s and 40s, one of the highest guys at the mob, Meyer Lansky on the right, discovered that J. Edgar Hoover liked to dress up like a woman and have sex with men. And that was very startling at the time. It would be startling today, but it was really startling at the time. And he managed to get a photo of them caught in the act. J. Edgar Hoover and his second in command, Clive Tolson. And it's a very famous story. It has a Wikipedia article. You can dig extensively into this. This is not like a rumor. It's quite well sourced at this point. And it was kind of common knowledge at the time amongst like people at the Bureau high up, but having a photo of it is different, right? And it's important to note, I guess we'll get to J. Edgar Hoover's history in a second. So what they did once they got this photo is they blackmailed J. Edgar Hoover into creating more blackmail, because that's often what happens. Like think Hunter Biden, for example. And what they started doing is they started having these sex parties at the Plaza Hotel, that building right there, where they had this room called the Blue Suite that was wired up with all these cameras. And with J. Edgar Hoover's help, because they promised him that he could also get the blackmail that they got, they had these wild parties where J. Edgar Hoover invited, or maybe the mob, I guess technically, like Rosenstein, who's one of the rum runners. He's in the center right there. Roy Cohn is a mob lawyer who is very close to Donald Trump. We'll talk to him later. These guys collectively started throwing these parties at the Blue Suite where all these powerful people could come, and they had this sort of like vow of secrecy, and they would basically just let loose and get real freaky. And there were underage boys there, there's underage girls there, and there was a whole bunch of cameras documenting all this blackmail. And J. Edgar Hoover is famous for having one of the most extensive collections of blackmail of anyone at the time. Unfortunately, the mob and the mafia also started collecting extensive blackmail on him and everybody else as well. And so when you think about the history of the mob and the mafia and how in our minds, in our history, we sort of realize, oh yeah, there's this time when they grew very, very powerful and the police never really went after them. It's because they had the leader of the FBI blackmailed the entire time. And it was such an effective scam, so to speak, that the mob had it. Meyer Lansky, he was in charge of the Jewish mob. And he went to the mafia and said, hey guys, I've got this great photo. Why don't we start working together? And with our powers combined, we can basically run this country. And they formed what was called the National Crime Syndicate, where they had this big meeting of all the most powerful mob and mafia bosses, people like Bugsy Siegel, people like Al Capone, Lucky Luciano are the ones pictured there. And they formed the National Crime Syndicate, and the mob and the mafia formed this partnership, and they worked together all the way until World War II, and maybe a little bit beyond that as well. And the FBI's hands were tied, right? And so this is what led to the era of gangsters. This is what led to the movie The Godfather. This is what led to all of that. And that culture is that's what we were in when we came to World War II, right? And during World War II, the FBI partnered with them. But that's another talk. We've done that before. So the mobsters that were blackmailing J. Edgar Hoover, they were instrumental in arming the early Zionists that were fighting for Israel's freedom at the time in the 40s and then the 50s. Because if you're going to found a country, you need weapons to do it. In this case, it was not a peaceful founding of the country. And regardless of which side of the conflict you fall on, this is just basic history, that the militant groups that were in Israel at the time that were fighting the Palestinians and the British, because there was this whole trifecta of violence going on, they were being armed by wealthy financiers that were helping them to get mostly, before World War II, it was a little harder to get arms from America, but after World War II, they started smuggling a whole bunch of the unused and unneeded and now like useless weapons from America over to Israel. And a whole bunch of the people that were in charge of those militant groups and that were in charge of those blackmail operations went on to be instrumental in the founding of Israel, the founding of the IDF, and the founding of Mossad. And just as one example, I guess I'll skip over the left side here. But this is the leader of the Irgun here. Did I put up on here, was Begin? I think he was the 5th prime minister of Israel. So Menachem Begin, the photo here, he was the leader of the Irgun, which was one of these very militant, essentially terrorist groups in Israel that was bombing British civilians in order to get them to leave. He was actually the one that planned the bombing of the King David Hotel, which is a very famous, like the first terrorist attack in history, so to speak. And this is just to say that the people that founded Israel in those early days were very familiar with the sort of violence and coercive tactics that it requires in order to make your way in this, kind of militant world in a post-World War II era. Jeffrey Epstein is from a different time, but it's only one generation removed from those people. And the people that first discovered how powerful sexual blackmail was are the people that trained his forerunners and are the people that founded Israel and the Mossad and the IDF. And so then we get to Jeffrey Epstein, right? And people like Alan Dershowitz claim Jeffrey Epstein was totally not a spy. But we all kind of realized, maybe slowly at first, but we all kind of realized that Jeffrey Epstein was not doing all of this on his own. He was clearly working for someone. The question is who? So when you start looking at the network around Jeffrey Epstein, he was brought into the fold of this intelligence work by Robert Maxwell, the father of Ghislaine Maxwell, who would become his madame, so to speak, the recruiter for the girls, the woman that could go and sort of befriend them and make them feel comfortable so that then they could come and be abused. Robert Maxwell a lot of times gets associated with British intelligence because he fought for Britain in World War II. But Robert Maxwell was a Czechoslovakian Jewish man, and he did fight for Britain. He actually has a crazy life story. He is a survivor, if nothing else. But his Jewish heritage eventually led him to work for Mossad and for Israel, and he's one of Mossad's most famous spies. And that is not a super contentious thing to say. His daughter, Ghislaine, has a whole crazy life history based on how Robert treated her and then how she projected that onto Jeffrey Epstein later. But this is Robert shaking hands with Queen Elizabeth II. Because people that grow up today, we don't realize how famous Robert Maxwell was in his day. But Robert Maxwell was an absolute rock star in America at the time. And a very, very powerful man. Ehud Barak is one of the most, one of the people that has been witnessed visiting Jeffrey Epstein the most out of anybody. At first, people were accusing him of using the services of Jeffrey Epstein, but in my opinion, it looks an awful lot more like he was Jeffrey Epstein's handler. Ehud Barak was the 10th prime minister of Israel. He was in office from 1999 to 2001, but he had a 30-year-long career in the IDF as head of the military intelligence services, which is essentially like being in charge of the CIA and all the other intelligence services in Israel. He was in charge of Unit 8200 that we'll talk about later. So this guy is like the head of the CIA of Israel. And he just happens to be visiting Jeffrey Epstein over and over and over and over and over in all of his different places. And they co-founded businesses, they co-sponsored businesses with money that they had raised from these operations. So to me, he looks an awful lot like a handler. I should also mention, too, that Robert Maxwell is the one that there's this period of life that no one talks about where Jeffrey Epstein went from being a teacher that he was unqualified for and working in a bank to then like the 80s, he was kind of gone and he was a money manager for billionaires. And then he shows up as this like sex trafficker. That middle period in the 80s, he was almost certainly smuggling weapons, maybe doing other stuff too, but he was smuggling weapons, and Robert Maxwell was a big part of getting him introduced to his friend Adnan Khashoggi and a couple of other kind of famous arms traffickers. Not really famous to us regular folks, but Leslie Wexner is one of the most integral parts of Jeffrey Epstein's network. He was the bank. He bought Jeffrey Epstein a lot of his apartments and his homes. He gave Jeffrey Epstein the vast amount of his capital that he was using for this operation. Leslie Wexner is the founder of Victoria's Secret, which also owns Abercrombie & Fitch and Hollister. It's the limited brands. It's a massive empire. His net worth right now is $13 billion almost, because obviously he has not been prosecuted. He's still walking free, despite the fact that he was literally the bank for Jeffrey Epstein, to the point where he signed his power of attorney completely over to Jeffrey Epstein. And what that means, just to clarify, is that this guy has $13 billion and like all these different companies, Jeffrey Epstein was given the authority to sell any of those businesses without Les's approval, to buy businesses without Les's approval, to make investments, to give money away, to do anything he wanted with Leslie Wexner's entire estate was the level of connection and trust that Leslie Wexner had with Jeffrey Epstein, right? Whitney Webb points out really astutely in her book, there's a page from it photoed up there, that Leslie Wexner has self-admitted that he is possessed by a demon called a dibuk, which is a Yiddish word, I believe. And he's talked about this openly in interviews as though it was like a good thing, as though he says this dibuk is what drives him to wake up in the morning and strive for more all the time. And the term dibuk is very much a negative demon, like a sin demon, not like a cute angel, just to clarify. And that's his own description of what drives him to success. We could go on about him for forever, and we'll come back to him and the CEO of Abercrombie a little bit later, but he was involved in more than one trafficking ring. Let's just leave it there. Leslie Wexner helped found the Mega Group, which was essentially a secret organization of Jewish billionaires that were working on behalf of Israel to spread, be it propaganda or to found companies that would help push Jewish ideology, or to do like Jewish study groups to help Jewish people travel to Israel to experience their culture, right? And I'm not trying to imply that all of that is necessarily blanket bad. I'm just saying that this group was a whole bunch of the most powerful Jewish men in the world that formed a secret organization, and they very much did keep it very hush-hush and under wraps. It was called the Study Group or the Mega Group. And Leslie Wexner was one of the founders, but also the Bronfmans were highly involved. They were a rum running company that was highly involved in that whole mob and blackmail operation back in the day. The Lauder family of Estee Lauder, if you're familiar with beauty brands, was heavily involved here. And the Lauder family, if you're not familiar, their money largely comes from mob operations initially, and then, lotion and perfume second. So the Mega Group was full of people like this doing these sorts of covert things behind the scenes. And it was not all necessarily an intelligence operation, but it had all of the hallmarks of an intelligence operation, an intelligence group, to the point where like they are photographed there on the right meeting with one of the prime ministers of Israel, which might be just totally up above board. It's hard to say, right? These sorts of organizations make it easy for an intelligence operation to hide behind legitimate means. Like, can you call it necessarily a bad thing that Jewish billionaires are meeting together to push the aims of Israel? That's not inherently bad. Like, that's perfectly fine if they're not committing crimes. But unfortunately, one of them was the bank for the largest sex trafficking operation the world has ever known, and several other of them have ties to the mob. And Jeffrey Epstein actually got a lot of his sort of support from people in this group and from this group directly. So that's where it starts to get a little gray area of what is a legitimate business and what is an intelligence front agency. And it's kind of hard to say sometimes. So by my assessment, and by many others' assessments, I'm not the first one to claim this by any means, Jeffrey Epstein was clearly from the Mossad, which is the Israeli CIA, right? And it's because when you look at everyone in his network, they were Jewish, and everyone in his network had some sort of ties to Israel, like the highest up people in his networks were either directly tied to Israel through being the ex-prime minister, the ex-head of the Israeli CIA, so to speak, or being some of the largest pro-Israeli philanthropists in the world, straight up to Menachem Begin, Ari Ben Menashe is the guy in the pink shirt, top left there. He's actually an ex-spy from Israel that came out and did a whole bunch of interviews where he directly said Jeffrey Epstein was Mossad, and I can tell you all these crazy stories about him. And they obviously slandered that and said like he's lying or whatever. But, if it walks like Mossad and it talks like Mossad. And then you look at a scandal like the Monica Lewinsky scandal, and there's another one where it's like, Monica Lewinsky was Jewish, and Bill Clinton was one of Jeffrey Epstein's primary targets, right? And we didn't know all of that at the time, but, it was kind of weird that the president was just getting blowjobs in the Oval Office. But then when you realize that President Bill Clinton was one of the most targeted people in the entire Epstein network, and then this Jewish woman just happens to break with this crazy scandal about sex stuff, and it has to do with these recorded phone calls because his phone lines were bugged somehow inside the Oval Office. And then actually the Times of Israel reports on how apparently Benjamin Netanyahu is the one that had the tapes, and he was trying to negotiate is like, we'll give you the tapes of all of this phone sex, 30 hours of phone sex, in exchange for you releasing Jonathan Pollard, which is an Israeli spy that they had flipped an American intelligence asset to work for Israel, and he was one of the most egregious leaks in American intelligence history. And apparently, allegedly, Benjamin Netanyahu was trying to use the Monica Lewinsky tapes to negotiate Pollard's release and extradition to Israel so that whole scandal could blow right over. It was also during a time when they were negotiating one of the most important peace deals in the Middle East that was going to decide the borders and sort of the agreed upon situation going forwards between Israel and Palestine. So a coincidence. This has never been acknowledged as being a part of Jeffrey Epstein, but when I look at it now, but knowing what we know now, this looks exactly like the kind of thing that the Jeffrey Epstein network would use as leverage. Because you don't necessarily want to blow up the entire Epstein operation and show your hand of all of the sexual stuff you've got on Bill Clinton just for Jonathan Pollard, but you probably want to fire a warning shot and say, look, you know how much more we have than this, Bill. Do what we want, or we'll make your life even worse. So, the targets. We all know the targets quite well, at least the most powerful and prominent ones. They were obviously presidents, princes, and the most powerful tech billionaires in the world. But there's a lot of other ones that a lot of people don't know, and that's where you start to get into the really interesting stuff. I couldn't help but to include Leon Black, one of the biggest hedge fund managers in the world. He allegedly raped an autistic or Down syndrome girl. The reports vary. These are the kind of people we're talking about. The black book is Jeffrey Epstein's contact book, and it has all of these names of contacts that he collected. And this is another area where it's important to clarify the ambiguity. Because there was never an investigation done, for some reason, who knows, we don't know who in this contact book was like a phone number he collected because he wanted influence versus a person that was blackmailed versus a person that was working with him versus a whatever. We don't know. And we don't have the Epstein list because our government didn't look for it or didn't release it. Like, they have all the tapes, they have all the evidence, they certainly could build a case, and they certainly could investigate it. I'll leave you to speculate as to why they haven't investigated it. And so that's why we're left to investigating it based upon what we do know. And remember, this is where we have to sort of like piece two and two together and do a little bit of speculation based upon what we do know. And when you actually look through all that evidence and you start to dig into what we do know, and you look at what the mainstream media talks about versus what people like Whitney Webb are digging into, there's some stuff that's really interesting that they try to keep out of the public light because it shows you just how much more vast and powerful the Epstein operation was than just trafficking girls to Bill Clinton, which is already crazy. Like, already real quick. Just rewind for a second and remember that that's the president of the United States. And he flew on Epstein's plane over and over again. He went to the island, probably. Like, we don't really know how much he was involved, but we know that Bill Clinton was directly blackmailed by Jeffrey Epstein, the president of the United States, okay? So from there, it's basically like everything is fair game. We all know about Bill Gates' involvement with Jeffrey Epstein, but actually what they have been doing is trying to frame it as though he never met him before 2011. And there is significant evidence that Jeffrey Epstein knew Bill Gates all the way back in 2001 or earlier and probably had deep ties to early Microsoft. They're very concerned with keeping that quiet for obvious reasons. There's also links between Jeffrey Epstein and various parts of crypto, Binance, FTX. Crypto is, somewhat infamous for being involved in crime. It's also involved in saving the world, but the line is complicated. Some of the most underreported pieces of Jeffrey Epstein's operation that is the most important is his interest in science, technology, and genetics, right? So he was funding like the MIT Research Lab, Harvard University. He funded all sorts of universities and these like projects and specific researchers because he was collecting scientists. And he collected them through blackmail, but also just through influence, through performance and like just showing up with all of his money and impressing people, through funding their research and giving them grants. And many of those scientists kept working with him after he was convicted as a pedophile. It's worth noting this bottom quote here too. In July, Bloomberg reported that Epstein's Southern Trust Company, one of his many shell companies that he used to fund things, is identified in U.S. Virgin Islands filings as a DNA database and data mining company because Jeffrey Epstein was very interested in DNA manipulation, in eugenics, in longevity, in all sorts of very dark genomic research. And he was also very interested in technology research, digital surveillance, and stuff like that. And it's not necessarily to say that he personally was, because remember, he was an asset for Mossad. So when you start to go down the rabbit hole of all of the scientists that Jeffrey Epstein was connected to or funding or hosting conferences for, it gets pretty wild pretty fast. Stephen Hawking is on that list. Marvin Minsky is just worth noting. Virginia Giuffre, who's one of the most prominent Jeffrey Epstein whistleblowers, who's been in court more than many of the other ones, she alleged that Marvin Minsky raped her when she was 17 and he was 73, I believe it was. So not all of these people are necessarily involved in that sort of perversion. Some of them are probably actually just there for the money or whatever else they're getting out of it, but some of them were there for the other stuff too. And you can imagine that Jeffrey Epstein, one thing he was doing is he was hosting these scientific conferences on his island where he was inviting all of these high-level scientists to his island, right? And you could imagine that in one way, you're acquiring influence over scientists just by funding them and impressing them. You're creating this atmosphere where they're all collaborating in your space. And so now you can go to them if you need, help with that company. And remember the intelligence network that you build out of all the different companies? You build it out of different researchers with different technologies, and suddenly they're all friends with this Mossad asset, and they have all this influence. But at the same time, you're probably probing for I've got all these really beautiful young women on my arm and we're on my private island, and Marvin, you look pretty lonely. Like, are you interested in any more? Right. And so by bringing all of these people in ostensibly for a conference about genomics or whatever it is, and flaunting these young underage girls in front of them, you sort of are achieving like 2 or 3 or 4 goals all at once, right? And imagine, and as we talk through all these different sort of things he was doing, remember that sort of tactic of how you're simultaneously acquiring blackmail and you're recruiting, and you're also just acquiring influence through these more normal means for anyone who's not looking for that other stuff, right? But these kinds of guys were exceptionally good at turning and looking the other way when it should have been very obvious what was really going on. I've just got 2 quotes here on the bottom. He was intent on clarifying that he always felt Epstein's intentions, even with the women, were benign. This is an interview with one of the scientists at one of these conferences. Quote, "This guy was actually not a bad guy," Shank told me at the end of our conversation. "I mean, put the 14-year-olds out of the picture. Those even make me think he was a bad guy. But to my knowledge, he was not a bad guy. He was a good guy. As long as you ignore the fact that he was raping 14-year-olds. And doing all this other stuff. That's the kind of mental gymnastics that these guys are doing, post-mortem, in order to explain their willingness to turn an eye from this and pretend like they didn't see it." Upper quote there. At one point during that meeting, so this is a meeting that he had kind of hosted between some of these scientists with Eric Lander, I believe. At one point during that meeting, says Pizarro, a helicopter touched down and the financier popped out with a young Slavic-looking woman. The scientists were all just in awe that a billionaire with a private helicopter had come to listen to what they had to say, he recalled. Right? So this is just to remind us that there's other ways to gather influence than just sexual blackmail, right? These scientists live for grant funding. And then the billionaire lands in his private helicopter with like 3 young, beautiful girls on his arm, and he is the dispenser of the funds. You will do anything. Your life's work depends on doing anything to get that guy's money. And sometimes maybe there's even more in it for you as well. Jeffrey Epstein also had a lot of other high-level individuals around him. So he wasn't just trafficking women that were sort of girls being taken advantage of for sex. He was also trafficking a certain number of very elite sort of operative women. And Nicole Junkerman is a perfect example. These women may have been trafficked in their earlier life. They may have been using sex as a weapon. It's hard to say exactly, but these are people that were extremely high level that wind up in these extremely high level positions after they've been in Jeffrey Epstein's orbit. And then we try to not talk about them because we don't want to blow their cover, so to speak. But Nicole Junkerman showed up on one of the few flights on the flight log with no one else except for Jeffrey Epstein. And it was 2 flights back and forth, and that got Johnny Vedmore's attention, and he started to dig into her. And it turns out that she actually was one of the founding board members of this Israeli tech company called Carbine 911. And she was on the board with, which this has been scrubbed since then, obviously, because don't look at Nicole Junkerman. But she was on the board with Ehud Barak, the handler of Jeffrey Epstein, the guy that was in charge of Israeli, military intelligence for 30 years, 20 years, whatever. So that's very strange right away. This immediately looks like an Israeli front company, a Mossad company. But then she's also since then worked her way into the National Health Service of the UK, and she's getting a lot. She's an extremely wealthy investor who has her tentacles kind of in all these different operations, and you can trace her back to Jeffrey Epstein's operation and to these sorts of Mossad-style connections. And so these are the types of people that they don't want us to look at. Carbine 911 deserves a lot of extra time, more than we have right now. Carbine 911 is sort of a futuristic 911 call service, so to speak, to oversimplify it. And they present themselves as this next generation 911 service that will allow technology and data to enhance first responders' ability to respond to crime. And it was founded with money from Jeffrey Epstein directly, money from Ehud Barak, and money from Peter Thiel, who we'll get to in just a minute. And its board was a whole bunch of people that were linked to Israeli intelligence. And when you start to dig into what Carbine 911 is all about, it's all about giving immense amounts of access to our personal data in a networked way to any 911 first response situation. And you have to kind of think a little subtly about it because once again, in an intelligence operation, there's a front and a back. And in the front of that, it's like, that's a great idea. We do want 911 first responders and police and fire and all EMS, all that, to have access to the most possible data so they can do the best possible job. But if you have a Mossad or a CIA company designing the software that gives a first response system access to all the data in all the networked, traffic cameras, any cell phone that's nearby, any piece of electronic equipment anywhere in the vicinity, they can access all of it in a networked way. Suddenly I start to think that's going to work great until a crime happens that they want to cover up. And then there's a back door probably built in because Israel, the Mossad, and the CIA have a long history of building back doors into all the software that they create so that they can slide right in and steal data from someone or take over a system. This has happened multiple times. The Promise software is one really famous example. And suddenly a 911 call when they're responding to a crime that we need to cover up can suddenly be manipulated quite effectively, can suddenly be taken over quite effectively, can be, you have to kind of like use your Hollywood imagination there, but it's a very powerful technology. And the implications of letting a foreign government create the infrastructure for our 911 response calls is pretty striking, not to mention the invasions of privacy that allows. And these quotes are just to clarify, it was revealed the Israeli company Carbine 911 had received substantial funding from Jeffrey Epstein, as well as Epstein's close associate and former Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Barak, as well as Peter Thiel. It claims to detect mass shooters before they strike, a service already perfected by Thiel's company Palantir, which he has developed as a pre-crime software, and it's already in use throughout the country. So pre-crime is a big part of this sort of tech frontier that Israel is leading the charge on. And I just wanted to give you a sense of this article. This is one article by Whitney Webb about Carbine 911. And these are my notes on just that one article. Because there is so much down this rabbit hole and it is so extensive, and I could never share with you even the beginning of all of it. But it all ties back to Unit 8200 is like their NSA, the National Security Agency. It's like their tech surveillance company or agency. And Carbine 911 is just one of many spin-offs of what Israel does, and this is openly stated by Benjamin Netanyahu that this is an intentional policy, is they purposely encourage their operatives from their NSA, so to speak, Unit 8200, to go on and start businesses and nonprofits in the private sector so that the Israeli intelligence links that they have will essentially be founding that nonprofit, that private business, whatever, and those private businesses become this massive network that suddenly you're no longer an Israeli intelligence asset, you're a private Israeli business. And suddenly you can be developing technology for the CIA, for American systems, for other countries, for Mexico, for Canada, right? And so a huge amount of the high-tech systems that are operating behind the scenes in our military capacities, in our policing capacities, in all of our daily lives are actually designed by Israeli people that come from the Israeli Unit 8200. This is in our airports. It's in our emergency medical systems. There's even one company that is developing a new alarm system for mass shooting drills in our schools, and that gives them access to all the biometrics, all the cameras, all the everything in our schools for lockdowns in case of a mass shooter event. That was also designed by operatives from the Unit 8200 coming out of the same sort of like Israeli tech network, right? So Palantir is not directly tied to that, but it's worth taking a moment because Peter Thiel is good buddies with these guys. He's actually very good buddies with Vance and with Trump. And this is a guy that we all need to be watching out for in the next 4 years and for the rest of his life until he's in the ground, because he named his company Palantir after the seeing stones from Lord of the Rings, where the lore is that, you are all powerful and all seeing. You can see anything anywhere in the world. But also any mortal man that uses that stone will become addicted to its power and corrupted by it, right? Palantir is designed, funded by a $2 million grant directly from the CIA initially, and then has now been a contractor for our intelligence agencies ever since. And Palantir's whole purpose is to create Minority Report in real life, to create an algorithm so sophisticated with access to so much data that it could predict crime before it happens by judging your social media profile, by judging your phone's location, by judging the posts you interact with, the camera systems in the city, people that you're nearby to, like literally any piece of digital data that you can imagine. Palantir is designed to amalgamate all of that into one gigantic algorithm so that they can predict crimes before they happen and go and arrest you because of what you are about to do. And they are already doing that abroad, for sure. And they're starting to do it in the United States as well. And it's worth mentioning that Israel is huge on pre-crime as well. And this is exactly how Israel polices Palestinians inside of the Palestinian territories in the West Bank specifically, and a little bit in Gaza. Because what they do is they act, and this is current and this has been ongoing for many, many years now, is Israel with all the cameras and all their biometrics and their access to all of the Palestinian phones and such. They actually arrest Palestinians for crimes they were about to commit. For people, you talked to that guy and he's known to be affiliated with that network, and so we're going to detain you preemptively to prevent you from becoming a terrorist. And then you get put in jail. So, coming to a government near you if Peter Thiel gets his way. But it's worth noting that Palantir is not just for preventing mass shootings and preventing violence and being used by police networks and military, because also it is used in war by the military. And, there are maybe some legitimate uses. It's just a very fine line. But it's also used in the financial world. And these algorithms are also being used by the biggest financial institutions in the world in order to, it's cute, the article that I cited, maybe I didn't actually include that clip in here, but it was cute. The article was like, the biggest financial institutions in the world use it so they can get the upper hand on each other. It's like, no, they don't. They use it so they can steal all of our money and they can front run all of our trades and they can all get rich while we all stay poor. It's not so they can get a leg up on each other. This is one of my favorite connections to Jeffrey Epstein that was covered up, and it's not reported on nearly enough. This woman's name is Peggy Segal. And if you're not familiar with how Hollywood works, Hollywood is all about who you know, not what you know, right? And if you're producing a movie, it doesn't matter how good that movie is, you need to have all of the biggest stars at your premiere. You need to have all of the right press, all of the right people talking about your movie. And so what the Hollywood culture has kind of gravitated towards is these publicists that throw parties that have these contact networks that invite everyone to sort of mingle and create those networks for your project, your movie, etc. And so one of the most famous power publicists in Hollywood is Peggy Segal. And if you can't tell in that photo on the right, she is over 70 years old because she's been doing this for a very long time. And she is famous for she brags about this, having a contact book with over 300,000 names of the most powerful people in America and around the world in her contact book. Because if you were going to produce a movie like Wolf of Wall Street, for example, a movie about, finance and Wall Street, she's got contacts in that book of all these big finance people, of all these people that have acted in the big finance movies, of like big executives at banks, and she's going to invite them all. So you'll get like a lead guy at JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs actually at your premiere, like as an example, right? And so her contact book is her life. That's her claim to fame. And that is what makes her so powerful. And she was one of the most powerful women in Hollywood for a very long time, because if she doesn't want to help you out, then you have to go to the next best person, right? These are the people that make and break entire, Hollywood productions. That's how you get Academy Awards and Oscars, etc. She was very good friends with Jeffrey Epstein, as well as Harvey Weinstein. And when the Jeffrey Epstein thing broke, she got blacklisted unlike anyone else from Hollywood. And she actually did this really funny interview with Vanity Fair, if I remember correctly, that's basically her whining for like a 4-hour interview about how like none of the men got blacklisted, only I got blacklisted. And it's like, fair, Peggy, that's fair. Like, yes, the world, yeah, I hear you, that's cool. But actually behind the scenes of what she's saying is another layer, because the reason she got blacklisted isn't because she's a woman. It's because of that 300,000 person contact book, because she was the person letting Jeffrey Epstein into all these parties. She was inviting him to all these parties, right? She was the network that was getting Jeffrey Epstein access to all of Hollywood. He probably had a few other friends too, but she is the most obvious and well-known one, to the point that when Jeffrey Epstein went to jail the first time and then he got out of jail, this is where Prince Andrew went to this party and he got in big trouble and he had to do a 60-minute interview about why were you over at Jeffrey Epstein's house for multiple days, and he absolutely botched the interview and it was super embarrassing. And so she organized that party. She organized Jeffrey Epstein's get out of jail celebration party. And she's the one that invited Prince Andrew and George Stephanopoulos and Katie Couric and everyone else. Woody Allen and his wife. And I believe this is a quote from Katie Couric. She said, this is on the left. She said Allen was seated next to her, and she asked how he met his wife, Sun Yi, the adopted daughter of Allen's former partner, Mia Farrow. Yes, so Woody Allen, like the 70-year-old guy, he married his wife's daughter, who he had totally not groomed. Quote, I had forgotten for a moment, but as it came out of my mouth, I knew it was too late, she said. The kicker is that Woody Allen was actually amused by the question because in the company of those men, of course he was. Because this is a culture and they've all gotten away with this for decades and they revel in this power, right? So the guests had been invited at the last moment by power publicist Peggy Segal. It was in December of 2010 when that happened. Prince Andrew, Charlie Rose, George Stephanopoulos, Woody Allen, Sun Yi, and Chelsea Handler. A lot of Jeffrey Epstein's connections to the modern big tech world have been covered up. Some of these are more direct than others. Obviously, Bill Gates, very direct. Mark Zuckerberg, a little less direct, but still there. Hard to say how much that was. Elon Musk, you know, he was photographed with Ghislaine Maxwell a few times. Hard to say how close that was. One thing we do know is that all three of the Google boys were very close with him and had a whole bunch of business dealings with him monetarily and potentially other things as well. I hate to say it, but Donald Trump has a long history with Jeffrey Epstein as well. And it's complicated to decipher, but it's kind of hilarious to go over these two pieces. So I want to share them with you. You remember that hotel we were talking about earlier, the Plaza Hotel, where the blackmail was sort of first invented, video sexual blackmail, where they had that blue suite with all those cameras? Donald Trump, one of his greatest mentors was Roy Cohn, one of the guys, the mob lawyer that was a big part of setting that all up. Donald, he used to call Roy like multiple times a day for advice. Roy was deeply important to Donald Trump's upbringing. So he knew about that whole story, I would imagine. Donald Trump later bought the Plaza Hotel. He overextended himself financially specifically to buy that building, which is kind of weird. He also later bought the boat of Anand Khashoggi, which he renamed as the Trump Princess. Anand Khashoggi was the weapons trafficker that Jeffrey Epstein was trafficking weapons with in that weird middle 80s period when he kind of disappeared. So Trump is on record buying. So, and by the way, Anand Khashoggi was famous for blackmail on that boat, for having girls and drugs and everything you can imagine. That's how he closed deals. And it was deeply rumored that that boat was full of cameras as well. Donald Trump also had a long relationship with Jeffrey Epstein personally, but it very clearly changed at a certain point. And so it's not clear what exactly this is. And liberals love to smear this as just a very flat surface level understanding of Trump is like Jeffrey Epstein's greatest buddy. But that is not true. And to me, and I'm not sure about this, but so far in my research, to me, it looks like Trump was a part of the trafficking networks and was a part of not the Johns, but the traffickers, and helped get blackmail or has his own blackmail. And at a certain point, he seems to have had a falling out with them or a change of heart or a change of allegiances or something. And something changed in the 90s and especially into the 2000s. And that to me would explain how he was able to break into this political space that is so controlled. That would explain to me why he is not blackmailed and why Hillary Clinton had to pay for a fake dossier to get made about a fake pee-pee tape from Russia so they could report on it for 3 years on Rachel Maddow, because he's not blackmailed, because he knows the game. And in some ways, it kind of makes sense that you need a guy that knows the game in order to change the game. And so I'm studying very carefully to see what he does over the next 4 years. And we all should be watching him very closely. And people like Peter Thiel, we should be watching very closely. But I am optimistic that we might have had our trafficker come along ready to break the club wide open, because we all know what happens when someone that the trafficking club does not like tries to come along. Doesn't go too well usually. And so far, Donald is doing a pretty good job. I was just checking in on our homies online. If you're online, it's good to see you. Thanks for tuning in. One of the other connections that gets covered up all the time is the Zorro Ranch. Less of a connection and more of a location, and a whole different avenue of what Jeffrey Epstein was up to. I'm just going to read this quote verbatim. As the New York Times reported on Wednesday, Epstein's, quote, passion for cutting-edge science at times verged into eugenics. Multiple sources told the Times that Epstein had described a plan to inseminate women at his ranch outside of Santa Fe, New Mexico. According to a shakier secondhand account, also relayed to the Times, Epstein said he wanted to use his ranch to impregnate 20 women at a time as a means of strengthening the gene pool. Epstein had a lot of connections to eugenicist ideas about only the high quality genes should survive, about how the wealthy should be the ones that are repopulating the earth because all of you poor people are not worthy of such. And he had a lot of connections, not only to genetics and eugenics, but also to weird breeding style programs. And Zorro Ranch, when you look at the mainstream reporting of Epstein, they talk an awful lot about his Palm Beach property. They talk an awful lot about his island, and they even talk about New York. But they do not talk about Zorro Ranch. And that's not because nothing happened there. It's because it was on a plot of land that looked like that, and he owned every square inch for miles around, enough so that he built a private airstrip on his private land. He actually, I don't know if I included the clip. I did. So he went to the county, I believe it was, in New Mexico and asked them if he could build a grass airstrip on the county land that he was leasing next door to his private land. And there was a problem with the permits, and they wanted to come in and inspect the land. And so he withdrew the request for the permit because he wasn't down with an inspection. And instead, he just went and built his own private airstrip on his private land a little closer to his spot. And so he had this wide open area with a private airstrip where he could fly people in straight into this property. And he built that mansion. I don't know if it was from the ground up, but he basically renovated it himself. So I do not know what is under it, what is inside of it, what's going on in there, but it's pretty big, right? It's 26,700 square feet. And Epstein was pretty close friends with New Mexico Governor Bill Richardson. He was also good friends with the current director of the CIA, William Burns. And it's not necessarily clear if he was like really good friends or just like the kind of friend that after a career in government, as long as that Wikipedia stack on the right of his shoulder there. So he was like the ambassador to Russia, the United States Deputy Secretary of State, United States Secretary of State, United States Undersecretary for State Political Affairs, ambassador to Russia, ambassador to the Near East. So that's like his long resume. And then William Burns, in 2014, left the Obama administration, and he needed a job in the private sector. And a guy with that kind of resume just didn't know how to get a good job in the private sector. So he went to his buddy, Jeffrey Epstein, for help finding a job. And when this came out during his confirmations for CIA director, they tried really hard to sweep it under the rug and to pretend like it didn't happen. And then when it got proved that it did happen, they were like, okay, it did happen, but only once. And then it actually turned out it happened more than once. And we're not really sure what those meetings were about or what exactly transpired there. But Epstein helped him get a job at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which is a military-industrial complex linked think tank. These are some of those like non-governmental organizations that are actually just arms reach parts of our CIA and our military industrial complex, where you can, create policy recommendations that are from an independent organization, obviously, for our military complex to say like, yeah, totally, you should go to war because it's in best interest of everyone. And this independent think tank, advised you on it. It just so happens that, it's all one big thing. That's what the think tanks are mostly, like the Atlantic Council, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Council on Foreign Relations. So Jeffrey Epstein helped Bill Burns get a job at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. So if you don't know anything about Carnegie Endowment, it's the kind of place where Jeffrey Epstein's reference will get you a job. And then he was tapped for CIA director by Joe Biden immediately following that. Jeffrey Epstein also donated bigly to many different Ivy League schools, especially Harvard and MIT. This became a big scandal when he got arrested the second time, and it kind of all came blowing up, and they tried to hide exactly how much it was and how much they knew, and eventually they had to rename buildings and give some of the money back out to the victims and stuff like that. He actually built his whole own like buildings in some of these, got it named after him, stuff like that. Whole scandal. And that's how he got connections to people like Noam Chomsky. If you're not familiar with Noam, he's like one of the most like leftist, anti-war, like vocal activists throughout his life. Theoretically, he's like a linguist and language specialist. And if you look at him, you'd be like, this guy is the most leftist lefty you could ever left. But he actually had many meetings with Jeffrey Epstein and seemed to be quite cordial with him during his time. And so when you start to, just to illustrate that, like, Jeffrey Epstein was not, and hey, maybe he was actually taking advantage of the trafficking services. We don't know. And I'm not trying to imply that. I'm just actually trying to imply that Jeffrey Epstein was not just interested in sexual blackmail. He was interested in any form of power and influence that he could spread under his network, because people like Noam Chomsky, for example, would be highly influential when the nation writes policies about what is and is not moral. Because Noam Chomsky is like one of the foremost experts on morality and on philosophy and on language, right? And so these are the kinds of people you would want to befriend if you wanted to be ahead of regulations or ahead of, the moral code of our country and the laws that would, come with that. So we all know about our boy Bill, and we'll talk a lot about our girl Hillary next week and her emails. But actually, Jeffrey Epstein allegedly helped found the Clinton Global Initiative. And it's been quite well corroborated at this point that he actually helped them devise the whole original sort of structure and was one of the first financial planners of the Clinton Global Initiative. And he donated to it on several occasions, at least early on. They've obviously tried to distance themselves from that quite a bit. But you can't distance yourself from the flight logs where your name is clearly written many, many times. And it's worth noting in that little piece above Clinton's head where it's squared in and zoomed in on, most of the flight logs are either first names or initials or sometimes first and last because it's Bill Clinton and he's that important. But then it's like Bill Clinton, GM. On the bottom right, it says like JG, GM, SK. So SK is Sarah Kellen. Once you read a lot of the flight logs, you get to know which initials are which because of the recurring passengers. And sometimes you have to kind of collate things and figure it out. But every now and then you see things like 2 females, 1 female, 1 male, whatever. And you don't know for sure, but that probably, in my opinion, implies the kind of people you wouldn't give a name to and you wouldn't notice if they went missing. And I'm not implying that they killed them or that I'm just saying he was on those flight logs. This is just an homage to what we're going to be doing next week. His wife had all these emails that got leaked that are real emails. By the way, we're going to be talking not just about Pizzagate next week, but we're going to be going to all these other avenues and kind of wrapping it all in a bow. And so I just wanted to share with you some of the emails that, because a lot of people don't realize that the whole Pizzagate thing did not start with a pizza parlor. And it didn't even start with Hillary Clinton's emails being about pedophilia or anything satanic or anything like that. It actually started with them doing a different investigation into Hillary Clinton for a different thing. And they wanted access to her email server. And it didn't, like, that shouldn't be a problem. You are literally like a public servant. And so then she went and destroyed them all and poured bleach over their destroyed corpses to try to erase all the evidence. But Seth Rich, one of her staffers, leaked all of these emails to WikiLeaks. And I have personally, that is not a rumor. That is like very much a fact. Seth Rich later died mysteriously. And these are some of the things that were in those emails from Hillary Clinton and from John Podesta. Quote, I think Obama spent about $65,000 of the taxpayers' money flying in pizza/dogs from Chicago for a private party at the White House not long ago. Assume we are using the same channels? Just think about $65,000 worth of pizza and hot dogs. Does that fit on a plane? Or are they talking about something else? Because then in another email, and these are verbatim quotes from these emails, quote, we plan to heat the pool, so a swim is a possibility. Bonnie will be Uber service to transport Ruby, Emerson, and Maeve Luzzatto, 11, 9, and almost 7, because it's really important you know that they're young children. So you'll have some further entertainment, and they will be in that pool for sure. And then lastly, from Marina Abramovich, the woman famous for spirit cooking, who's standing over the table with this is a fake body because they don't take photos at the real parties, Marina Abramovich writing to Tony Podesta, Hillary Clinton's campaign manager and very, very close friend. He's been in her administration and in her campaigns, etc. Dear Tony, I am so looking forward to the spirit cooking dinner at my place. Do you think you will be able to let me know if your brother is joining you? All my love, Marina. And this is Marina standing over one of her works of art, the kind of things she does at these spirit cooking dinners where they create things like cakes that are shaped like human bodies with the organs spilling out, and then they eat them. That is a real story. And yes, they have real parties with people like Hillary Clinton and Jay-Z and Beyonce and Barack Obama. Yeah. So the big picture. Jeffrey Epstein was targeting powerful men using vulnerable girls. And he wasn't just using the girls. And he wasn't just doing it in one way. But the world is ruled mostly by men, for better or for worse. And men, for better or for worse, especially the kind that wind up at the top of these corporations in this kind of corrupt world, a lot of them have some pretty dark tendencies and demons inside, especially when you dangle these kinds of things in front of them. He was also using that operation to fund tech and genetic research on behalf of Mossad, using both blackmailed connections and blackmailed money and just general influence. Because remember, he wasn't just interested in his personal gain. All of this was for an intelligence network, building the network of corporations that they could work with, building the network of scientists they could access, inventions they could leverage, technology that they could utilize or hack or create backdoors in or whatever else. Things like Carbine 911, things like the genetic research of people like Mr. Lander. He was blackmailing very powerful politicians around the world on behalf of Israeli interests, like releasing Jonathan Pollard, or like the Abraham Accords, or like, I don't know, some stuff happened over the last 4 years when Joe Biden was in. And if you look into his son and his family, you might find some stuff. He was collecting blackmail in Hollywood and facilitating the already rampant degeneracy that was all throughout Hollywood. And this gave him access to modeling agencies. And those modeling agencies gave him access to an infinite stream of poor or destitute or disadvantaged young women that just wanted to make it, that he could fly to a place like South Africa or Spain and sweep them away to, we're going to make your career, we're going to get you to Victoria's Secret. Remember, this is before cell phones. And so then just get on my jet and we'll fly you to America and we're going to totally change your life. And then they wind up on the island. Jean-Luc Brunel is the man in the middle of that upper photo of girls between our two pedophilia guys. And Jean-Luc Brunel was one of the most infamous model scouts that was feeding girls to Epstein. And he was also abusing them himself. And he was French. And he was in jail when Jeffrey was in jail. And they both just so happened to hang themselves. Whoopsies. And I also don't want to get off of here before we mention that Les Wexner was in charge of Victoria's Secret, but over here we got my boy who was in charge of Abercrombie and Fitch, and it turns out that Abercrombie and Fitch, you remember like the shirtless boys in the 2000s, Hollister is also just a subsidiary of Abercrombie and Fitch. It just broke like last month that he was trafficking all of those male models for his own male ditty sexual pleasure vibes, as well as probably selling those services to other people around the world. And so he is currently in jail. So a lot of people like to point to Epstein being Israel, but actually I would urge you to think a little more deeply about this. Because yes, Israel is a huge part of Epstein's network, but he is indicative of the deep state, quote unquote. And the deep state is a complex term and it can mean a lot of different things. Usually it just means any unelected people in the government that we didn't vote for that can kind of live there for 50 years, like George H.W. Bush, and he's like CIA director and then he's president for a minute, but then he's back to these unelected posts and they're just kind of influencing stuff without us choosing for them to do so. And they have insane amounts of power because of that. That's kind of like the typical deep state. But there's this other blob that we don't have a good name for. Like Alex Jones calls them the globalists, and like everyone has their own name for them. And to me, they are the criminal networks, the black market networks. They are the people with real power. And it's not just the Jeffrey Epsteins of the world. It's also the drug traffickers, the cartels, right? Because the drug traffickers are working with these same people. They're like the human traffickers are working in these same networks. They're both laundering money through the same banks. Those banks are both funding all of the same corrupt corporate CEOs. And all of these networks behind the scenes are utilizing all the same services and networks, right, to gain power together. And they're all protecting each other. Right. And so there's this deep state, like darker deep state behind the scenes. And it is all of the criminal networks working in harmony, at least partially in harmony. Right. And if you are those criminal networks, you run the drugs, the guns, the trafficking, and a lot of the other corrupt stuff in our world, you're highly interested in not getting caught, not getting exposed, not getting your operation shut down. And so how do you do that? You have to influence the front markets, the legal side of our world. You have to influence the laws and the politics and the prosecutions that would come for you. And you do that by utilizing all your resources. And you're the guy trafficking all the people. And so you are already established to blackmail everybody, because blackmail is the most powerful form of control you can operate. And so it's no wonder that the people running the black markets are deciding to blackmail everyone, because over time, I was just having this conversation earlier today, imagine a city where there's no crime and everyone is not corrupt and it's all great, and you introduce dollars. Dollars will inherently corrupt a few of those people. You got 1 million people, suddenly there's a few corrupt ones, but then they get to the top of the system, and in the next generation, a few more people are like, hey, it's really easy. Like, look how this guy got there. I'm going to get there too. And over time, a financial system can very easily corrupt any kind of culture, right? And our culture has always been pretty corrupt. This is not new. But as we've become more and more corrupt, and more people have climbed to the top through either, shady means or downright illegal means, that creates a space where those corrupt groups actually have more and more power than even the legal networks, right? And it's pretty apparent when we look out at the world now, if the human trafficking networks can actually be blackmailing the president of the United States of America within the Oval Office itself, that is a pretty strong indication that the black market has more power than the white market these days, right? And what we are seeing is the symptom. We're not seeing Jeffrey Epstein's operation as its lone little thing. He is just one operator in the global network of trafficking, in the global network of blackmail. Diddy is another one. But there are many, many, many more. Peter Nygaard was another one. Like, there are so many, right? And we are just starting to see glimpses of that network that is constantly working, already established. And anyone that is in a position of power today has been confronted by, approached by, targeted by these networks, because if you're powerful, they want your power. And if you won't play ball, they have to do something about that. And if you will play ball, then you're all good. Right? That's the world we live in today. It's a world where organized crime has become so powerful that they can run a trafficking network across our entire culture, and they can essentially control everything from the inside. So next week, we're going to go there. We're going to talk about these fine folks. We're going to visit Tom Hanks's baby sock collection, if you don't know about it. We're going to find out about Oprah rescuing children from foreign countries. We're going to visit Woody Allen and his daughter or wife. Spielberg is also in there. Yep. We're obviously going to visit the emails. We're going to take a trip to Marina Abramovich and the spirit cooking. We're not going to leave out Jay and Beyonce, because I'm really hoping that I can have those private investigators come knock on my door. The ones that have been going around to the Diddy people telling them that they'll pay them to report differently. I'm trying to get on that list. So, that is the state of our world today. And I'm ready for questions.
Thank you, Ian Carroll.
I'll do my best to answer them as fully as I can. I definitely don't know everything, and I'll let you know when I do and don't. A night like tonight will inspire some of the easiest questions ever. It'll be no problem. So bring on the controversy, bring on whatever you got. I'm here for it.
Ian, do you believe man went to the moon?
Love it. Good question. I flip-flop. I think it's highly unlikely. And I see all sorts of elements of how we might have faked that. I actually talked about the Lookout Mountain Observatory last week.
So, Ian, my first wake-up moment was Building 7, 9/11, and also Philip Schneider, the Dulce, New Mexico alien firefight. What was your first moment?
In some ways, it was Building 7, 9/11. Though I was young at the time, I was in grade school. It planted a seed, and when I was in my teens, I revisited it through Zeitgeist, the movie, and that got me. That was the first time that I thought critically about a global event and realized that we had been lied to. And I was still, just a leftist that was kind of doing my thing, not paying attention. But that seed prepared me for when 2020 and the BLM riots broke out. And I was near Seattle. And I'm looking at the leftist BLM thing, or rather the leftist COVID thing, paired with the we're going to go burn down the city in, 1,000-person mobs thing. And that just rose all kinds of alarms. And that one thing led to the next.
So we know Epstein didn't kill himself, and we know Seth Rich didn't kill himself. But the big one is John McAfee didn't kill himself either. He claims that he had McAfee virus software installed on all the government computers that he used to backdoor to download a bunch of blackmail material on them. How come his name has seemed to disappear into the memory hole?
That is such a good point and question. And if you don't know about John McAfee, go home and look up some documentaries about John McAfee tonight. He's so crazy and so cool. And you better believe that you're going to be getting some lies thrown at you, because anything about the deep state, anything about the trafficking networks, anything about any of these powerful groups, they have billions of dollars to lie to you about it, right? And they're deeply incentivized. So John McAfee is one of these figures that there's all kinds of crazy propaganda about, and you kind of have to dig to get the real story. And I think that he's been memory holed so much, partly because he kind of made it easy in the sense that he was out of the public eye. I mean, he was an absolute spectacle, but he was kind of out of the public eye and away, and they sort of were able to take care of him somewhat quietly and then turn the focus. And if I remember correctly, he was killed during COVID. Before? It was during, right? And so is he really dead? That's another good question. I am of the mind that he's probably dead. Seems most likely to me. They're very powerful. And I'm of the mind that he probably was a real threat to them based upon his life. But I also haven't dug it super deep, and I don't have a super strong opinion. He's just super cool.
Ian, what do we know about who has ownership of the Zorro Ranch and some of these other properties that Epstein used to be in charge of?
Great question. I was just digging into it a little bit the other day. And Zorro, I'm not going to remember the exact name because I'm not super eidetic like that. But Zorro Ranch was recently, so they had it on the market for a long time trying to sell it and no one would buy it. And then a shell company, essentially, which is it was clearly created in order to shield the identities of the purchasers, was created, I think, last year, and purchased it for some number of millions of dollars. And so to my knowledge, we do not know who owns Zorro Ranch now. I've not found anyone that's dug into that financial rabbit hole, and I'm not that skilled. My understanding is that it's basically secret now. His New York property and his Florida property, I haven't looked into who's bought them either. But it'd be a fun rabbit hole. I mean, the real one is his island, right? And that temple on his island. And last I checked, his island was getting turned into an amusement, a tourist park. And they had demolished the temple as far as I'm aware. And all that I know is that that's shady. And I would hope that more brave souls would go sneak onto that island with video cameras and show us what's in there, because there's been some crazy YouTubers that went over there, or you could just get a Disney cruise and go snorkeling nearby and then just, accidentally walk onto shore.
All right, so that number definitely went out online because we have about 280 questions already.
Let's go.
So the online folks, if you get your question read, it's probably going to be like winning a little mini lottery. And then if you're in the room, you're going to get your question read if you raise your hand and I bring the microphone to you. So I'm sorry, but that's just the way it is with all the attention. But I'm going to read one to you really quick from online. Do you believe some of the celebrity deaths we have seen over the years, like McAfee, Michael Jackson, Paul Walker, could actually be in hiding because they knew too much?
I love entertaining this one, and I don't have a super strong opinion either way. Like for example, Michael Jackson's a cool one to tease out a little bit if you're not familiar. Michael Jackson's death is covered in shady stuff, and there's all kinds of reasons they would have killed him, and there's all kinds of ways they would have killed him, and we talked a bit about that last week. But there's this video online that I think is probably genuine, but it's kind of hard to, like, maybe it's fake, who knows? It's from the age before AI deepfakes, allegedly, theoretically, and it's like the coroner's van, or rather the hospital van driving him to the morgue, and like his stretcher comes out and he's like dead on it, and then he like they like wheel it around and it's out of sight kind of, but then it's not, the video can still see him, and he like gets up and gets off and like walks into the room, and it's like, maybe, like, I don't know, I have not done the deep dig into like that license plate number and that van company and all the, I wouldn't put it out of the realm of possibility. And this is where we come back to that whole, you don't need to make up your mind on everything and pretend like you know. Like, we are just lowly peasants in a large world. And you don't need to know if like John McAfee is alive or not. You can just have fun speculating. And you might think, like, to me, it seems like, you know, a pretty solid chance one way or the other. You can kind of, you know, play that game, and that's fun and worth doing. But you don't need to decide like you know for sure. And I don't know for sure. But I think it's certainly ridiculous to say it's impossible.
Like 4 years ago, I heard Putin mention that the Bolshevik government was mostly Jewish, and it kind of made me scratch my head, so I started digging into it. Have you ever connected the dots from the Bolshevik government to Israel?
I haven't done a whole lot of digging on that train specifically. I've done enough to know that there is probably some legs there, and I've tried to access enough sort of like deeply educated sort of scholars rather than just like online pundits, and to know that there is certainly an argument to be made for the original Bolshevism that sort of founded the communist revolution, and the, at least the, shall we say, like political identity of Israel, the Jewish identity of Israel. I don't know of any direct ties between the people themselves. And it's just a space where it's like, it's so contentious and it's so shrouded in sort of historical misrepresentations and obfuscation that I haven't really seen it worth my time yet to dig it super hard for sure. Because the longer back in history you go and the more contentious an event, the more uncertain you are if you're reading a real source or not, the more uncertain you are if you're reading propaganda or if this has been altered or if this has been lied about. And the more you have to sort of be like, you have to actually devote time and energy to primary sourcing it in a way that, like, I would rather know about whether Joe Biden is being blackmailed by Mossad right now because his son is kind of doing some weird stuff. That seems more important to me now. And I'd imagine that over my life, I'll sort of catch up on all this deeper stuff. But the way I look at it is that sort of longer train of research about the history of sort of like Jewish religious and cultural sort of political situations, all the way from like the Khazarian stuff to the Bolshevik stuff to, you know, to the early Zionist stuff. I see enough there to not throw it out with the bathwater, so to speak, but I also see enough complications that I remain skeptical and just try to like judge it carefully.
All right, same general topic with several questions coming in on that same similar topic.
Bring on the Jew questions.
So you said at the beginning, basically, that you're not talking about all Jews, and we all have friends that are Jews that are great people. There's probably Jews in the room that are great people. And so we're not like completely generalizing. However, when you look at who's pulling the strings on these different industries and things, and you go up the chain, the chain of command, are you seeing a overwhelmingly abnormal percentage of Jews based off of population representation that are basically running things that are very evil?
Let's be clear. They passed a law, or they introduced a law in the Senate and the House last year that said that it was illegal. I'm unclear on the specifics. It's illegal to promote the anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that there are Jews at the top of all of these different industries. So just, I'm not saying that, but when you actually go and read about like who's in charge of like Google and the New York Times and the banks. And there's a lot of Jewish people in charge of a lot of these organizations. That's just factual. It's not like contentious. The question is like, is that nefarious or is it not? And by my reckoning, when you look at the Epstein network as just one obvious example, like a lot of those people, it's not like you get to be the head of Google by accident. Google wasn't just like, oh, I have a great idea and now I'm a tech billionaire. Google was founded on tech money from these intelligence agencies, on grants from like the CIA and these other organizations. And so these people are not getting there just by skill. They're getting there because they're selected to be there. And especially when you look at an organization like the banks, right? And so when you start to look at how it's like, oh, there are actually a heck of a lot of Jewish people at the top of specifically media and banking, as well as pharmaceuticals and many of these other industries, that does not look like an accident to me. And so then the question is it just people of one race kind of looking out for each other, like Italians look out for Italians and, black people look out for the brothers? Like, is it just Jews looking out for Jews? Like, probably to some degree, yes. But then you look, it's like, oh, hey, we have a Mossad blackmailing operation operating at the highest echelons of power, and they're all working together for Israel's best interests. Like, that starts to look to me like it would be very easy to overlap one with the other. And I think we should be careful about trying to pretend like we know more than we do. But then when you look at like, oh, Sergey Brin is one of these people that often gets cited, Sergey Brin, anyways. That is a dude who's a known associate of Epstein, who we know was going to Epstein to get access to trafficking, like laundering money and stuff like that. Like, and so, yeah, there's a lot of Jews at the top of this stuff, and they're not necessarily all bad, but you have to ask, how did they get there, and who put them there, and who are they interacting with once they're there, and what are they doing once they're there? And when you actually start to read about what they're doing up there, it looks a lot more like they're not just like the average Jewish person, but rather they seem to be awfully cozy with people like Jeffrey Epstein, doing sketchy stuff. And so I would hesitate to correlate them to regular Jewish people. Because in the exact same way, like, I am nothing like Bill Gates. Bill Gates is a lizard, and I am an American man. So, like, to all Jewish people around the world, you don't need to identify with these sickos. They're not good people. These are some of the worst people in the world, and you don't want them as a part of your group. They're not good. They're horrible. They're trafficking children. They're raping kids, right? And so it's like you don't need to tie them to your religious, racial identity. They're not like us. They are billionaires, right? They're corrupt, evil people. And so I'll just leave it at that. Like,
thank you, Ian, for coming. Longtime follower since the grocery store aisle
heck
days.
yeah. Thanks, brother.
You mentioned Trump and J.D. Vance twice tonight, and I just wanted to ask you a question. Looking forward, what are the things that you are really keeping an eye on, policy-wise, funding-wise, that we should be looking out for?
Great question. And the first thing to say is I'm super new at this. Like, I am very inexperienced, and no one should be looking to me for like high level political advice, right? Like, I'm literally just a dude who started doing this like a year and a half ago. And I am no political strategist. I am no like great wisdom. I'm just doing my best. And the way that, and I've also not really, I've only, been awake for 1.5 political cycles, so to speak. So, realize that I am no expert. But what I'm going to be looking at is, did they fulfill their promises? Because a lot of what got me interested in supporting Trump was his promises to RFK and his promises to we the people and his promises to do something differently this time than getting absolutely taken advantage of and handled like he did last time. Because he was new last time. Like, that's understandable. He didn't even expect to win. Why would he have expected to win? So I got some grace for how it's gone, but now that he's made promises and now that he's coming in prepared and now that he's surrounded by this really high level cadre of experienced people that I believe are relatively good, I'm looking for him to deliver on those promises. And then I'm also tracking people like J.D. Vance and tracking the money like the Adelsons that have been clawing at their campaign. And I'm looking for what are they going to do about those donors. And in particular, as one example relative tonight, I am very curious to look at what they do around Israel, because that's one of my biggest concerns about all of them. Can't imagine why they're all so pro-Israel. But I'm particularly interested to see what they do around Gaza and Israel and what they do around like APAC and America, and how they sort of address like, because they are America first, but like, are you actually America first, or are you money first and winning elections first?
You heard of Greg Reese?
I have not.
He works for Alex Jones Network.
Love him. I already love him. Will do. Will do. Yeah, if you haven't heard what's happening with InfoWars, my understanding is that recently they forced them to auction it off because of the Sandy Hook thing. F you guys. And so they're just basically trying to like, okay, so we're not allowed to lie on live TV. Is Rachel Maddow going to get a subpoena? Are we going to sue Rachel Maddow for $1 billion? And so they tried to take InfoWars away from Alex Jones and the team. And then it actually turned out that the auction was fraudulent and the judge reversed the order. And so hopefully they're back. I mean, like, and this has nothing to do with your opinion of Alex. This is just about free speech. And like, if we're not going to prosecute Rachel Maddow for pushing a Russia hoax, like literally they convinced liberal people to this day believe that Donald Trump is a Russian spy and that he was given to us by Russia and that they have him peeing on like a supermodel peeing on him or something like that. This whole made up story, and they don't even realize that Hillary Clinton's campaign paid for a dude to make up that entire dossier. They knew it was fake. And all of that is just a giant lie they smeared across Rachel Maddow and every live TV for 3 years. And they're not getting fined. Just Alex Jones, because he had some questions about a very suspicious school shooting. And maybe he was wrong. I don't know. But they certainly are turning the frogs gay. So I stand with InfoWars. I would recommend everyone else stands with InfoWars. I'm glad they're still on air.
Epstein was like the great unifier when he allegedly offed himself. Now that we have the new transition coming in and a bunch of takeovers of the next teams, do we suspect or anticipate any more Epsteins possibly happening? And do you think that would be a unifier, or do you think it'll bring more conspiracy theories coming in should any top people all of a sudden come in? You think like
could you clarify for me? Do I think that we'll catch more trafficking rings, or
just the fact that like how Epstein ended up happening, how he ended up, it seemed to unify each side, both the left and the right did not believe how it ended. With the new administration coming in, everybody seems to have a mass exodus. There's this theory that everyone's going to go. How they're going to go? Are they just retiring? Are they quitting? Are they going out in a different kind of way? If any of that ends up happening in a negative kind of way, do you think it'll create more conspiracies, or if they go out in the Epstein kind of way?
So one thing I love about my job is I have infinite job security, because there will never be a shortage of conspiracies, because as long as we have billionaires, I will have a job. I do think that in this new administration, I'm hopeful that we're going to have a massive cleansing of the government, both because people are going to run for the hills. They're going to move across seas. Thank you. Goodbye. Good riddance. But also because, for example, Matt Gaetz, who is hopefully our AG, right? Yeah. Yeah. And Trump is being very adamant about pushing him through. And that gives me immense hope, because like, I don't really care what you think about Matt Gaetz's past political policies at all. Because to me, the only thing that matters, I'm kind of being facetious there, but to me, the only thing that matters is Matt Gaetz was recently on the Benny Johnson show on live TV on X. And he said about our boy Jeffrey Epstein that he believes that Jeffrey Epstein was killed in prison by a foreign intelligence agency, not an American intelligence agency. And he said, quote, I'm not going to say which one, but by a foreign intelligence agency. And so what he clearly is saying is that Matt Gaetz is aware that Epstein was Mossad and that Mossad killed Epstein so that he would not expose everything that I've just told you about. And if our incoming AG knows that and is willing to say that on live TV, so to speak, that is extremely bullish for Bill Clinton behind bars, for example. And maybe that's a lofty goal, but I am optimistic that this new transition team, though there's probably some bad apples in the bunch and there's probably a lot of corruption amongst them and they're not going to be perfect, I'm super optimistic that we actually do get some true disclosure. And if we don't, back to the former question, that will be them reneging on a promise to us And it will be us that will hold them accountable to that, because they told us they were going to doge this thing. They told us they were going to have accountability. They told us they were going to release the Epstein list, the Diddy list, the JFK files, what have you, right? And we expect that, and we should. And we shouldn't just roll over because it's like, oh, it's okay, it's a Trump. No, Trump, F you. Give us the files. Put them in prison.
Okay.
Or below the prison, maybe. Just saying.
Okay, is this working?
Yes.
Okay, we are sort of fixated on Obama right now. He's sort of the black sheep. Where you see him going, do you think he's the person that's running the White House? He's approving long-range missiles into Russia. Is he trying to blow everything up before Trump takes office?
So if you're familiar with the history of George H.W. Bush and Richard Helms and the CIA's heroin smuggling operations in the Vietnam War era, then you have a pretty solid parallel to what we're seeing now, in that Barack Obama, if you don't know the history, Barack Obama was raised by a CIA asset named his name was Barry Soetoro back then. He was raised by a CIA asset named Lolo Soetoro. And there's this whole, and this is not like a crazy conspiracy theory. This is very much his actual history. When you get past the wall of obfuscation and screaming that they try to keep you from going beyond, is he was prepared for us by the CIA from basically birth. And it's a very common theme that these people change their names partway through their lifespan to sort of give them a fresh start, after which they will become a public-facing figure that will somehow miraculously wind up being the president of the United States of America. And if you know the history of George H.W. Bush and Richard Helms torching all the files of what they did at CIA when they discovered that they were about to get absolutely screwed by the public finding out, I think we're at a similar point with Obama, where he has been involved in some pretty dark stuff ever since he's been in the public eye, particularly when he was president. And he certainly has been involved behind the scenes now. That's the whole deep state thing we're talking about. And so I would assume that now that Harris has lost, they're either cooking up some crazy assassination, cyber attack, crazy plot thing to try to pull off to save their skin, or they're figuring out how are we going to burn the maximum number of files and hard drives and get the heck out of here as quickly as possible, metaphorically speaking. And I don't think it's going to work. I think they're screwed. And I think that Big Mike is also probably screwed.
InfoWars is a LARP. Think about it. The guy Alex Jones came out of nowhere like a comedian with an altered voice. Sandy Hook sues him. Oh no, you can't be Ian Carroll without threat of billion-dollar suits. He's only there to add crazy to truth. We already know. And to go too far in conspiracies that silence you, Alex Jones is a CIA plant.
I love addressing this angle because even if you love Alex Jones to death, I think it's important to realize that there is at least a certain kernel of possible truth in that angle. The angle being that Alex Jones was actually presented to us and is a controlled opposition. And even if he doesn't know it, they have success. So maybe he knows it. Maybe he's literally a CIA agent. That seems pretty unlikely to me. Like really unlikely. But maybe there's a world in which they were so effective at smearing Alex Jones, and in some ways this is true, and I think that Alex knows this, and his whole team knows this, is that Alex became powerful enough in the conspiracy space that he was a threat. And so then they found a weakness, which was his accusation of Sandy Hook, and whether he was right or wrong, they had an angle with which they could smear him so powerfully that he could become a pariah, that now, and this is what they do with their word language. If you know about how leftists work, this is what they do, is they create a phraseology that has a mythology behind it, like Black Lives Matter, right? Or like I can't breathe, or, my body, my choice, right? Or Pizzagate, right? They create these phrases, they create these word weapons, and packed into them is this whole aura of propaganda around it. And so when you think about how a leftist views Alex Jones, now they have a weapon where anything that Alex Jones talks about, oh, that's just an Alex Jones conspiracy theory. You don't even need to look into Pizzagate because it's crazy, it's debunked. It's just Alex Jones stuff, right? And to some degree, Alex knows that, and that is true. But to some degree, the tide is turning. And the whole world knows that that's just Rachel Maddow stuff, and you don't need to listen because she's opinion programming, not news, officially, literally. And then there's a deeper layer where in the internet space, you shouldn't trust anyone. And I don't. And I've spoken with Alex and I've spoken with lots of these other people. And when I interview with someone on the internet who's another like truth seeker, I don't pretend like, oh, I'm sure for sure this person is totally 100% great. And there's not even a chance that it's like, I don't care. You could be a CIA agent for all I care. If you're talking about this stuff and you're sharing evidence that I can double check and share with the world too, and we're getting 100,000 views about how Jeffrey Epstein was Mossad and how we need to address this issue, I have no problem with you being a CIA agent. The CIA can totally come help me live stream this stuff. No big deal. And that's why in this new world, it doesn't really and you know, this is exactly what a CIA agent would say. It doesn't really matter who the information is coming from as long as you can double check it yourself. And as long as they're encouraging you to think for yourself, because that's the weapon that the intelligence agencies cannot, the propaganda cannot penetrate that, because they can only penetrate it if they're creating a fake narrative that is not corroborable with evidence. And the moment that we decentralize it all and we all just share information based on evidence, who cares? CIA, come hang out with us. I don't care. You can be a part of the conversation. We'll get more views. Right?
Will you please give Ian my phone number? I'd like to ask him out on a date.
Sorry, I'm headed out of the state. And I don't date people that I can't see. Nice try, CIA. Next time.
I got a question on the weather manipulation. Where are you at with, is it exist? Is it BlackRock, Vanguard, government, or what? With North Carolina, especially, and what's happened with our American folks?
It's a great question. We know if you haven't done the weather manipulation dig, it's pretty clear by now when you actually dig into the evidence that we're way past beyond reasonable doubt that weather manipulation has been available for a very long time, for decades and decades and decades. And that can be everything from cloud seeding, like spraying the kinds of like microchemicals in the air that just sort of attract water vapor to it's like not complicated science. Like a 7th grader could figure this shit out if they just thought it through for an hour. And we have been doing that for a long time. Dubai literally created floods on accident because they weather manipulated themselves so hard, like last year, the year before. Then there's the more sort of complex version of the question, which is the HARP system, which is other types of weather manipulation that are possibly far more powerful, far more tactical or specific. And I have not gone super deep down the rabbit hole because I haven't seen any sources that make me feel like I could know for sure. And to me, I just leave the door wide open because, for example, the CIA was conducting mind control experiments way back in the 60s. They had a gun that shot an ice dart with a blowfish poison that would kill you and then melt. Like the types of technologies that our CIA has had for like 60 plus years, the skin masks, which is a real thing, by the way. You should watch the TED Talk from the woman that was the CIA's director of disguise, talking about how she briefed George H.W. Bush on the skin masks, wearing a skin mask in the Oval Office, and he didn't realize it. The types of stuff that our government, our DARPA, our CIA has had for decades is crazy. And so for you to think that you're so smart that you could outsmart DARPA and you know what they do and don't have, to me, that sounds ridiculous. And so I err on the side of it's probably possible. And if we see evidence, then we should probably look into it. And when you look at the hurricane that hit North Carolina, I have not dug in for veracity, so I'm not sure if he's quoting misinformation. There was some stuff that I saw about planes that were flying very strange flight patterns around the edge of the storm as it came to break landfall, right? And I think they were dumb because the storm was not a good look for anyone. It was horrendous. It was a terrible tragedy. And if you were trying to be political about it, I can't think of a worse look for Democrats than what wound up happening for them. So I don't really know what the plan was there or what exactly happened there, or if it still happened. I don't know. But I keep my mind wide open.
From Jason in Idaho Falls, why is there such stigma with mentioning the connections to Satanism and SA ritual abuse when it comes to trafficking?
That's a really good question for anyone that doesn't know what we're talking about here. SA ritual abuse is satanic ritual abuse. And people that lead regular lives like to live in this fantasy world of thinking that because you don't know any horrible people, they don't exist. But I need to remind you that we live in the most peaceful time the world has ever known. And it is almost 0%, it is probably 0% of human history where anyone has ever been able to live an entire life without seeing a dead body, let alone seeing murder and rape on a daily basis. Like for most of human history, humans have been horrible animals where violence and strength ruled, right? And it's only a very recent invention, like in the last 100 or so years, that we have large swaths of populations that live in relative peace for basically their whole lives. And so your little bubble of humanity is a like peaceful and normal place is an illusion, right? And our whole world is full of people like this and far worse that do things like satanic ritual abuse. And we have hundreds of victims on the internet that speak about this every day, and it is really hard to listen to. But there is copious evidence, like, and I'm not saying it's like some cool conspiracy theory. I'm saying like there's copious evidence that there is an element of a satanic power group in this new world order. Somewhere in this black market trafficking network, there are Satanists. And they're not saying they're all Satanists. I don't think they are. But there's more than enough evidence that there's a powerful faction within them. And when you think about the type of people that are gaining this type of power, the most powerful billionaires in the world that are engaging in human trafficking, that are raping children, that are like, let's be clear, blackmail is not just sexual stuff. Blackmail is also murder. Blackmail is also making smut films. Like, I don't want to like break everyone's brains, but when you actually go down the rabbit hole of what the blackmail networks actually do behind closed doors and what they actually threaten people that they will do to your family if you ever rat them out, like those are the people that can control the world through this means, because they have no filter, they have no limit, they have no morals, and they will do all of the things that you know they do to your own family in front of you, and they'll film it if you ever cross them, right? That's how you control the world, is by being that evil. And when you have 8 billion people in the world and all these billions of dollars, and you have a whole network of some of the most evil people in the world, you're damn right that some of them are the most evil people you could ever imagine. And that includes Satanism. And if you don't know about it, you could watch my talk from last week all about the music industry, and you'll get a healthy dose of Satanism right from the Grammys themselves. So there's this natural human desire to live within our comfort bubble, that it's not possible to imagine that things this evil are happening to children within our country, within our cities, within our, like in basements, like just down the street possibly. But it is absolutely happening in this country, and it's certainly happening like across the border in Mexico and in other countries around the world, because this is a global network. And one last little teaser here, or concept to kind of float on, is last week we talked about MK Ultra, and MK Ultra was the CIA mind control experiments, and there is very strong evidence that what they settled on was dissociative identity disorder is how you control people's minds. Dissociative identity disorder is a trauma response, usually to sexual abuse as a child or to other extremely traumatic situations where your personality splits into multiple fragments. And it is well known that those different personalities within you may or may not know about each other. And there are ways to sort of program things into one and not the other, to teach things to one and not the other. And that is how you build the Manchurian Candidate that they were seeking back in the 60s, right? And we don't know if they ever achieved it or not. Although Chaos by Tom O'Neill is a great book to learn about that. But we danged well know they were trying for a very long time, and we danged well know they were interested in dissociative identity disorder, drugs, and what that comes to is ritual abuse of children produces dissociative identity disorder. And so when you pair this kind of a network with a intelligence network, right? So they want those outcomes, those mind control outcomes. These are the exact same networks that were doing MK Ultra, and they're doing the exact same types of activities that create dissociative identity disorder. Like, it is actually reported by these survivors that that's how you become a Jeffrey Epstein, is by surviving your own dissociative identity disorder training, so to speak. Your own, they call it programming. Some of them, they call them their alters, like your different personalities that you have been trained to split into. And if you can survive that process and become a highly competent individual, that's how you get promoted into this network, because those are the kinds of people that you can manipulate and trust, right? Right? And so when you hear the stories from these survivors, it is deeply tragic, but it makes it is so beyond logical that when you put intelligence agencies and the darkest organized criminals in the world together into one room and you give them the goal of perpetuating their enterprise, that's how they do it, right? So it sucks to talk about and it sucks to learn about, but SRA is very real. And if you're very brave or strong of heart or want to make a difference in this world, learn about it, listen to survivor testimony, and I'm sure you'll find something to do about it.
Thank you, Ian. I have a two-part. First part, thank you. Second part, question. First part, thank you. I want to say thank you to you, Ian, for coming to Idaho and spending your time and your effort and your treasure.
Thanks, David.
And as to that, I want to thank Mark as well. I know Mark gets a lot of thank yous here, but I want to thank people like Mark and I want to thank people like Misty, because what they do that I would like to ask this crowd to do is they open up their homes and they take people like Ian and they take people like Judy and they bring them into their lives and they live their lives around them and they incorporate them into their lives. And they do that not only with these people, they do it with the Idaho State Legislature as well. They open up their homes to the legislators so they have a place to come from out of state and so they can have a home when they don't have enough money to live here at the Capitol and to do our work. So I want to thank all of them for doing that because it's very gracious and they're amazing people for doing that. But my question is this. First off, how many 3, and it's a little bit more because Mossad is 6, but how many 3 and 6-letter agencies do you think send operatives to listen to your presentations and to follow you? And also, have you had any instances that have been out of place where you feel that you're being followed? And then can you also talk about the social media phenomenon where people are coming out to people's homes that are bringing news about P. Diddy into the light?
Yes. I would imagine that there are lots of AI surveilling me all the time, as well as all of us. And I'm probably on every list imaginable. I would imagine that I have been scrutinized by intelligence agencies from our government, from other governments, and from private corporations on many occasions in my digital identity. I think it's possible that I've had agency interaction in some form that I wasn't aware of. I've never had any obvious circumstances. I've never felt like I was being followed in any way that scared me or stuck out. Maybe if I do real good, that'll change. But there's this phenomenon happening right now where I got a call from a friend who's a really, really powerful, popular YouTuber named Amala Ekpanobi yesterday, telling me about how the day before she'd been visited at her old address by these 2 private investigators that were looking for her. And they were trying to ask her, she got on the phone with them through her old roommate, and they were trying to ask her if she was being paid to push content about P. Diddy. And after a lot of sort of hostile conversation with them, she coaxed out of them the fact that they couldn't say who they'd been hired by, but they'd been hired by someone who was interested in maybe paying her more to say the other things about P. Diddy. And then they got caught on video at another guy's house just yesterday doing the same exact thing. And I was talking to Amala. There's the same group of guys, and they apparently have a list of like 10 influencers or more that they're trying to go around to and talk to. So maybe if I'm really good, I'll get a visit. Although I kind of doubt they'll find me here, but we'll see. And to me, so if you haven't checked the news, I just found out through my friend that P. Diddy actually just got raided in jail because he was like trying to witness tamper and jury tamper from inside of his jail cell. And he was making phone calls, and he was taking notes, and he was doing all these other things. And he was trying to kind of like still lead his operation and like kind of, play chess from inside the jail. And they raided him and caught him with all this stuff. And to me, all of that kind of plays together and that all kind of syncs up. And so it seems pretty likely that these guys are either directly affiliated with Diddy, trying to change the narrative before his trial, or actually we'll come back to how retarded that is in a second, or they might be associated with someone like a Beyonce and a Jay-Z or a J-Lo. We know that J-Lo has come after influencers before with lawfare and other such things. So these other celebrities that are implicated and probably going to have some unsavory things come out about them if the P. Diddy stuff breaks, they might be sponsoring that too. But I real quick want to just Diddy, if you're watching, that's such a dumb tactic, dude. It's not going to work. A, we're not getting paid by some like super good corp to spread all of your like horrible shit on the internet. It's just the truth. And so you probably shouldn't be sending people to our homes to give us content about trying to pay us to push lies, because we'll just publish those videos on the internet. So you should think it through a little more. Like, duh.
All right, final 10 minutes here. Will you next week present to us everything you know about Frazzle Drip?
Yes, we will be talking about Frazzle Drip. I don't know that much about it because no one knows that much about it, because a lot of people died in the researching of such things. A lot of people went, there's a lot of questions. A lot of bleach got poured on servers. But we will be covering Hillary Clinton's emails, the Podesta emails, Huma Abedin stuff, and everything in between.
First of all, Mark, thank you very much for opening your place here for this beautiful talk and opening our eyes, and everybody's eyes was open already, open many more. And very great meeting you in person the other day too. So a question about technologies that you're saying that Israeli companies are actually inputting into our either 911 or any other type of industries. Are we really not capable, or we actually feel like we kind of like either blackmailed or something not to do and allow the other agencies to pretty much input themselves in different governments?
Great question. Let me make sure I'm hearing it right. The question is, why is it that the U.S. is letting Israel develop all this critical infrastructure for our high-tech systems instead of just developing it ourselves, right?
Yeah, correct.
There's a couple pieces to this. And if you aren't familiar with the history of Mossad and the CIA and Israeli intelligence and American intelligence, we have been joined at the hip since it was founded. Our CIA was basically a floundering failure for its entire life, more or less. And at the start, Israel's intelligence services were far more capable because they had been busy founding a country for the last 30 years through subversive means. And so they were very experienced at espionage. And there's another piece where Israelis had access to Jewish people because they all identify with Israel, and Jewish people look like all sorts of different people. So you could suddenly infiltrate all sorts of different countries because you had people that looked like all different people, right? Whereas like, how are you going to hire some Alabama farm boy to go to Sudan and pretend to be a local, or to like infiltrate like China and try to blend in? Right? So Israel had a couple legs up in a couple different ways, and from a very early part of their history, they were linked by many things, and James Jesus Angleton is one of the juiciest rabbit holes to dig into there, of a person that was probably a literal Mossad asset in our CIA, he was the one that was responsible for the panic of Russia has nukes and they're going to nuke us at any minute, and they're so powerful, and they've subverted everyone's a Russian spy. That was James Jesus Angleton sort of like producing this panic within us, and it was kind of all made up. And he is buried in Israel because he was really good friends with them. But there's this other piece where Israel has been a leader in tech for a long time, and all of the founders and CEOs of many of these tech companies are Jewish. And then there's all this blackmail floating around. And so it's actually part of Israel's long-term strategy, and they state this openly, to become dominant in the tech space. And because they are our greatest ally, why would we ever have any concerns about them building our tech space, except for like if they did the Promise software thing again, or like except for like if 9/11 happened again and then this weird text message went out to people at the company. So there are some questions of why do we trust them to make all this when they have a history of surveilling us in many different ways, and of gathering data on us in many different. So for example, on multiple times, Israeli companies have been involved in both private and public operations to surveil American citizens or to get blackmail and dirt on American citizens. Like Harvey Weinstein went to Black Cube and used Israeli cybersecurity company Black Cube to spy on and collect private information on his accusers so that he could harass them and intimidate them and blackmail them into shutting up, right? So there's many instances like that where these Israeli tech companies that are ostensibly private companies but are actually directly tied to Mossad because they're all buddies. That is what they are. And they have been weaponized against American people many, many times, as well as people all around the world. So the answer is it's a horrible idea, but it's pretty obvious why they're getting away with it.
4 more questions. Do you think Candace is as innocent as people portray her?
Awesome question. I love Candace Owens, and no, I certainly don't think she's as innocent as people portray her. I think that Candace is a shrewd killer. She's also a wonderful, lovely human being. And like, I don't know everything about Candace Owens. Like, I'm not like her personal best friend, or anything like that. So who knows, But every interaction that I've ever had with Candace Owens has been very real and raw. And she's a mom, and she's like rad. And as far as I can tell, she's just doing what she believes is right and doing her best at it. And we all have our own strategies, and she has hers, and I admire it a ton. But I do not think that she's like sweet and naive and like she is a killer, and she's doing a great job. And don't stop, Candace, because we love it, and it's hilarious to watch.
All right. From Idaho, Austin, do you believe the rise or allowance of retail theft along with other crimes is connected to Peter Thiel and the surveillance state?
Such a good question.
Could Trump be the Trojan horse, especially now that he won the popular vote, given Vance's connections and close friendship to Peter?
So this is the angle that Whitney Webb is exceptionally good at reporting on. And I highly recommend you go to unlimitedhangout.com and read some of her reporting on Peter Thiel and on Carbine 911 and on Palantir. Because this is one of the biggest concerns about Trump for people that actually scrutinize him, is that he has made lots of promises and statements very passionately about how he likes these ideas of these tech solutions for crime, these tech solutions for the border. And before he knew better, he was saying the same thing about tech solutions for the money. Fortunately, he's walked that stuff back a little bit. But to kind of restate the question, what the concern is that if you let crime get really rampant, then the people will clamor for a solution. And the solution to rampant crime is a lot of surveillance, right? The solution to 9/11 is, right? And so when you start to allow a problem to get really bad, and then you have your buddies working on a solution that just so happens to also be, a piece of the most Orwellian nightmare you could ever imagine, that gets very concerning. And Trump is quite friendly with some of these ideas. And from the way that I'm looking at it, I don't believe that there's like a shadowy cabal that controls everything. But I do think that a lot of these corporate CEOs chat. And I do think a lot of their interests are nefarious. And I do think a lot of them are multi-layered. Like, I do believe that big pharma and big food and big ag are collaborating to make us sick and sell us fake medicine and make this profit circle. And that is a cross-market, conspiracy of a very high order. And this is a similar one where this is talking about like, are politicians deregulating and creating the circumstances for crime to be rampant, for all these problems to require solutions, so that, because remember, those are politicians, these are spies. And the spies are the ones blackmailing the politicians and giving them their jobs and paying them all this. And so like, it's not that far of a stretch to say that the spies might be working with the politicians to bring in a better, obviously like a safer future for everyone, like obviously for the greater good, because you wouldn't want your kids living in crime. So we need the people to accept Carbine 911 because that'll make us all safer, right? So yeah, I am concerned about it, and I am watching it. And read Whitney Webb because she's the GOAT.
What's your opinion on the definition and real life examples of an NPC?
I think it's hilarious, and when I'm being flippant, I'm totally with it. And the world is full of NPCs. But I also think it's important to remember that we're all people, and calling people NPCs is basically you giving yourself an out from being your best self and admitting that you can be fooled too. You might be wrong too. Like, we all have programming. And just because you think that you're like all like clear pilled does not mean you're better than everyone else.
Define it really quickly.
Define being an NPC. An NPC is someone who's programmed by the media, by the propaganda, by the advertising, by the news to basically just regurgitate what the establishment tells us to want and think and say and buy. And you basically just go about your whole life living out this programming, which is very real. Like, it is directly programming. And they are, advertising, propaganda, media, all of that stuff. They have studied programming for decades, and they are trying to program us. And an NPC is a person that does not realize that and just buys the glitzy stuff and watches the celebrities and the sports and regurgitates the stories. And that's real. But they're also a real person that you can access if you actually treat them like a real person. You can talk to them. You can make a change.
Awesome. Josh from Idaho, who you might know, he has a question. What's the deal?
Boy.
What's the deal with Ghislaine Maxwell's secret mysterious husband, Scott Borgerson?
I don't know anything about Scott Borgerson, but I bet that Josh knows, and I'm going to have to go have a beer with him later and ask him some questions.
All right. I have one last question for you. And it's only 4 words. You ready? The question is, but are we back?
Yeah, we're back. We're back. And it's not like we're done, but we're back. Because we're back on the trail. We're back on free speech. We're back on progress. We're back on disclosure. And everything that this government is promising to us, everything that they are showing us through the appointment, like almost everything, it is in the direction of we're back. And so I had this really great talk with Derek Bros the other day about don't vote or vote, like be a pessimist or don't be a pessimist. And I am so strongly of the belief that we have to work with the tools that we're given, right? And we have to do the best we can with every tool that we're given. And right now we're being given so many tools. And sure, maybe Trump has some things like going on with Peter Thiel. Maybe he said some concerning things about this. Maybe he's super pro-Israel and I'm not into that. Whatever it is. But just because there's one bad thing in the bunch of the politics of the most powerful empire the world has ever known, oh no, there's like 1 or 2 bad things in there. That doesn't mean that we're not faced with the best set of tools we've seen in our entire lifetimes right now to make a change. And so right now is the time to push to make a change. And you could sit on your ass and be like, oh, but Trump is a Zionist, so like we're screwed. Yeah, sure, who cares? Or you could get off your ass and you could use this time to call for all of them to be their best. Because if not now, when? Right? If not now, when are we going to make a change? Right? Are you going to wait for the next Democrat president to come in? Like, are you going to let them smear Trump for 4 years and and just create the same madness in like World War III and then say it was all Trump's fault, and then 4 years later we get the next CIA president, and then you're going to start making a difference, right? So, right, like the time is now. The trafficking is being exposed. Trump is back in. There's, if not now, when?
Yeah, thank you, Ian Carroll. Appreciate you being here. Hey, everybody, feel free to stick around and chat with people and meet Ian after the fact. We really appreciate you all being here. Have a great night.
If you're online, please subscribe to Old State Saloon. If you're in the bar, please say thanks to Mark next time you see him. Places like this are 1 in a million, and they only exist because of him and his family and their hard work. So give it up for Mark Fitzpatrick, for the whole staff. Thank you, Old State Saloon.